Now, I'm delighted to say we're joined by the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson, for his reaction to the Chancellor's budget. Thanks very much for being on the programme. We'll talk lots about the numbers. I'm sure Ed will have a bit to say about that as well. But I was very struck by one of your tweets today where you say, note what the Chancellor didn't mention, nothing on public sector pay, no mitigation of big income tax rises coming in this April, no more money for public services post-2024. Still some pain on the way.
Yeah, it's. I mean, you've just shown the pictures of teachers striking, and the biggest challenge facing the government and arguably the country over the next year is this public sector problems with nurses, teachers, doctors, and a whole group of others who have been getting really big pay cuts last year and this year. The government said they've only got 3.5% to give in the coming year, when inflation will average more than that. Experienced teachers, maybe 15% down on where they were in 2010, but no mention of any additional money to help sort those strikes out. And no additional money post-2024 penciled in for public services generally. Now, public services have actually got quite a lot of money over this Parliament. It is true that austerity is way behind us in that sense, but the next Parliament, if those numbers are kept to, will look really tough.
We just heard from James Chancellor, who said, look, this is about tax, really. That's something not for a budget. Is that fair?
Well, not really, because the Chancellor said he's sticking to his fiscal targets. He's only just by a hair's breadth meeting what is not a particularly sensible fiscal target, actually, which is to get debt falling in a particular year in the future. And he's only doing that because he's making things up. He's kind of pretending that fuel duties will go through the roof next year. Well, they're not going to. He's sort of pretending that, I hope he's pretending that this corporate tax relief will be temporary. I mean, he said he wants it to be permanent. It should be permanent. I think he's pretending that public spending will be really, really tight over the next few years. So I don't think it's fair to say that, if you're putting something so much stall by fiscal responsibility, you have to take seriously what the Chancellor says about what he's intending on spending.
Is that right, by the way, what the Minister was saying, that if they'd kept it permanent, that it would have broken their rules, like an extra £9 billion?
Well, it probably would have done, yes.
Right, but as you say, the rules are their own constructs.
And indeed, and I don't think, I take rules as serious, fiscal rules probably more seriously than the 99.9% of the population. But I don't think we'd have been throwing our hands up in horror if instead of meeting them by £5 billion, they were missing them by £5 billion because of a change. There were a permanent change on the corporation tax thing. And the problem with doing that corporation tax change as they've done first, it should have been announced at the same time as the corporation tax rate was announced 2 years ago. I mean, it's not sensible policy making to change it 2 weeks before the fiscal year begins. And second, having made the change, it should be a permanent change, because actually, structurally, it's a sensible thing to do. If it's permanent, it's not such a sensible thing to do just temporarily.
And, Paul, it seems like it was a very targeted budget, if you like. There were no big bangs in it, no massive surprises. Do you see it as a Chancellor pursuing a steady as she goes approach now for a pre-election splurge next year? How did you see it stacking up politically, if you like?
Well, I mean, there were two big things in it. The corporate tax thing, we talked about, the childcare thing, no doubt you've covered. Actually, a doubling in the amount of public spending on childcare. And really, I think, moving to the end of a 20-25-year gradual change to the shape of the welfare state is quite a big thing. It's hard to see where there's space for a splurge next year, given that, as I said, he's barely meeting his own fiscal rule as it is. And growth, while a little bit better than expected, isn't looking fantastic. So is he really going to have lots of money to give away pre-election next year? Hard to see. I'm sure he'll find something. I'm sure he'll find some way of doing it. But I think this was it was a technical budget. I think it was genuinely making some changes which will help. The childcare corporation tax, I'm not so sure about the pensions tax changes, but it was, and actually changes to disability benefits. These are technical but important and, broadly speaking, I think, sensible changes.
Just to jump in, why are you not so sure about the pension tax contributions?
Well, I mean, several reasons. I mean, one, Chancellor talked about it as being a response to problems with doctors and the NHS. Well, if that was the target, he should have changed the NHS pension scheme. It didn't. You don't need to change the entire tax system to do it. Secondly, it will, of course, also allow people to save more in their pension. So while some people may stay and work a little bit longer because they can save more, some people might actually retire a little bit earlier because they have saved more, because they've been able to. And actually, the people who might really be affected by this, he's kept the very sharp taper in, which means if you're on above about £200,000 a year, then you lose everything that he gave very, very quickly. So it's going to benefit a very particular group of people on high earnings, but not the sort of super high earners.
And could even have the opposite effect for some others.
Well, it could have the opposite effect for exactly that reason.
Can I also, so growth was one of the big things and kind of underlying a lot of the improvement in the numbers, the fiscal numbers, the economy looks a bit better than it did last time around, and so that matters. But there is a disparity, actually, maybe we can show the chart, there is kind of a disparity between what the OBR thinks is going to happen to growth and what the Bank of England, for instance, thinks. Let's see if we can bring this chart up here, because it kind of shows it. And it includes basically looking at what the growth profile was before the pandemic, so it was kind of a line basically going up. You can see that there, and then where it was afterwards. But the interesting thing is, so that's the latest numbers, and they're obviously they're better than they looked last time around, better than November. But then you bring the Bank of England numbers on, and they're pretty, they're pretty depressing by comparison. So are we at one of these moments, Paul, where actually a lot just depends on whether the OBR's got its sums right, and it could well be that everything looks, a fair amount more grim? I mean, which of these numbers, I know you're kind of a fiscal forecaster, but which of these numbers are you more kind of convinced by when you look at them there?
Well, the OBR is closer to what most other forecasters are saying. The Bank of England is really quite pessimistic. I mean, the Chancellor must be thanking his lucky stars he's got the OBR giving him his forecasts and not the Bank of England.
Red line rather than the blue line.
The bank is really pessimistic about the capacity of the economy to grow over this period, and the OBR is more reasonable. Actually, what they're talking about is an average of 2% growth over the subsequent few years, which isn't too bad at all. I mean, all I say is I just hope the OBR are right, because if the bank's right, then we really are in trouble. But it's a very strange thing, isn't it? We've got monetary policy being based on one set of forecasts and fiscal policy being based on an entirely different set of forecasts.
But it's just a bit better. I mean, so no recession. That's something that, that's one of the big stories out of today. I know it's an arbitrary thing, but nonetheless, it suggests the economy is better than it was, but just still pretty grim, and the next few months aren't necessarily going to be especially... The feel-good factor isn't necessarily going to be there.
Oh no, for households, the feel-good factor's not here at all. And I mean, what they worry about is what household incomes are doing. And as the OBR says, we might not be going into a recession, but incomes are still sharply down last year and this year. So not down by the full 7% they thought in November, but still down by 5% or so. Still the sharpest fall in household incomes certainly in living memory. And that's partly because, of course, of inflation and earnings not going up with prices, but it's also significantly because there's this great big tax rise coming in next month, which is the fact that income tax allowances and thresholds are not going up in line with inflation. That'll leave the average basic rate taxpayer about £500 worse off, the average higher rate taxpayer about £1,000 worse off. That's actually quite a big contributory factor to this living standard squeeze.
So it's partly created by the government, despite what the Minister was saying a moment ago.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, isn't it? I always like to ask this question because it's something the government always throw at you in interviews, and I always wonder what the sort of the advice of someone like you would be. Jeremy Hunt says this is all about proving the doubters wrong. It's all about showing that the government policy is starting to bear fruit when it comes to the economy. How much of this gradual improvement is due to the government, or how much of it is due to external factors that they have nothing to do with?
Well, it depends on what your baseline is. I mean, clearly things are doing better than they would have been had the sort of mini-budget measures not been unwound. Over this year, though, this is really all about the energy prices coming down and the economy doing a little bit better for other reasons. Though if you do look at the OBR numbers, they do think that a little bit of the growth at the end, and you never get more than a little bit from what you do in one budget, is down to this budget getting more people into work in particular. So I don't think we should sort of sniff at the fact that there's quite a lot of, I think, quite sensible policies in here, which over the long run will bear some fruit. OBR is scoring some of that as improving the size of the economy into the medium term. And it's really worth stressing that getting these things right, getting corporation tax right, getting childcare right, getting the disability benefit system right, getting the pension tax system right, each one of them adds up into a system which, if it's just a little bit more right, does allow the economy to grow a bit more in the future.
But the issue is, Paul, isn't it, that this is a Prime Minister who has 18 months effectively before he calls a general election. And if he can't get the economy right and get people feeling like their lives are getting better under this particular administration, he's at risk clearly of losing an election. Do you think he can somehow turn it around, or are really the sort of quite anemic growth figures, the constraints on public finances, just too big a tide for him to turn?
I think a lot of it will depend on how it feels in a year to 18 months' time. As I said, I think this year through to the early summer is going to look quite difficult. I think the economy will begin to grow, according to these forecasts, the middle of this year, end of the year. Real incomes should start to be moving in the right direction in a year's time. And there will be an opportunity to chuck a little bit more money at some people in the autumn statement and in the budget next year. So it depends to some extent whether people think, well, we're now on the right path, we're at least moving in the right direction, even if from a sort of rather low point, or whether they're thinking, well, we're still actually worse off than we were 3 or 4 years ago, so we don't feel very good about that. I mean, the truth is that come next summer 2024, household incomes probably will still be below where they were pre-pandemic, and people aren't going to be feeling very happy about that, though they may just about be moving in the right direction by then.